Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan and joining me today is Husain Haqqani, former Pakistan ambassador to the United States, well-known Pakistani public intellectual, author, journalist, former editor with the Hudson Institution now in the US, and author most recently of India versus Pakistan, Why Can't We Just Be Friends? Husain Haqqani, welcome to the show.
Pleasure being here, Siddharth.
We've had you before and it's always been great discussing India-Pak relations with you. You now have a new book with a rather provocative premise or provocative title, because each time we've met, bilateral relations have been in a tailspin, and this time is no exception. And yet you say, why can't we just be friends? Tell us the premise of your argument.
Well, the premise of my argument is that India and Pakistan have to start dealing with each other as countries rather than carry on the political argument that took place in the subcontinent before partition between the Muslim League and the Congress. That argument was based on two different narratives of nationalism. The Indian National Congress advancing the notion of a secular Indian nationalism from Khyber Pass to Kanyakumari, and the Muslim Leagues initiated the notion of the two-nation theory, that the Muslims and the non-Muslims were two different nations. That argument is no longer relevant because 69 years have gone by. Next year we will celebrate 70 years of our independence. So we should look at each other as neighboring countries. And there it's very interesting that Pakistan's founder Muhammad Ali Jinnah had said that he wanted Pakistan and India to live side by side like the United States and Canada, which is a very friendly relationship, a non-militarized border, an open border, free travel, free trade. Similarly, Mahatma Gandhi, who had not agreed with the idea of partition, when he realized that it is going to take place, he said that India should treat Pakistan like a joint family would treat a member of the family who has decided to go and set up a separate house. Basically meaning that let us keep them in the family, but do not insist that we should treat them with disdain or disrespect. What has happened in the last 69 years is definitely not what the founding fathers envisaged, and I am asking everybody to come back to the vision of the founding fathers. These quarrels you refer to are the result of attitudes, and I am calling for a change in attitudes on both sides. Pakistanis have to stop trying to compete with India because India is much larger. Indians have to stop being shall we say, holding Pakistanis in contempt, and we need to start working towards that goal of a US-Canada like relationship. And of course, the end of terrorism is a must before we can even get there.
The irony, Hussain, is that from 47 till about 65, when the memories of partition, the bloodshed, the massive displacement was much more fresh in people's minds, it was still possible for India and Pakistan to live like neighbors.
Well, I point out in my book that between 1947 and 1951 there was virtually free movement of people. Then until 1965 there was no requirement of visa.
Exactly.
There was a specific kind of passport that was called an India-Pakistan passport, and people traveled. Things started becoming worse after the 1965 war. I've given the history. It's a brief book. It's not a big book, so your readers can actually read it very easily. It's 175 pages. Most people have said it's about a 2.5-hour read.
Yes.
Gives all anecdotal material as to where things went wrong, who did what that was wrong. But look, the biggest misfortune of Pakistan was that the partition gave Pakistan about 19 to 20% of the population of British India, 17% of its resources, but 33% of its army. Instead of a situation in which Pakistan would raise an army proportionate to the threat it had, it ended up having an army and looking for a threat that was proportionate to the size of the army. And that has been a major problem. But let's be honest, some people in India have also not thought of Pakistan as the neighboring country with which we should have normal relations. They still see it an extension of the communalist arguments before partition.
One of the obstacles in India and Pakistan having normal relations, and in a way putting behind them the toxic after effects of partition and the two-nation theory, is that both India and Pakistan in some ways regard the Kashmir dispute between them as being the product of partition and the two-nation theory, where Pakistan believes that Jammu Kashmir, because it's a Muslim majority area, belongs in Pakistan, and India, because it never accepted the idea that a country like India would be defined by the religion of its people. It's a secular country. For that very reason, cannot accept Pakistan's logic. And as long as, so how central is the Kashmir dispute and attitudes, political attitudes in Pakistan towards J&K as being this unfinished business of partition?
Well, as
to the fact that the two countries are.
As a Pakistani, it's rare for somebody to express the opinion I'm about to express, but I will say it. I see the Kashmir dispute as a manifestation of attitudes between the two countries rather than as the cause of the bad blood. And let me explain. The reason why Pakistan was not able to negotiate accession of Kashmir was because Pakistan didn't pay attention to the princely states at all. There were 14 other states that were inside Pakistan or close to Pakistan, and Pakistan managed to get only one accession on the day of independence, whereas India had negotiated almost all except 6. So it was a lack of homework, and then Pakistan did a standstill agreement with the Maharaja of Kashmir, but then broke that standstill agreement by trying to send in a tribal lashkar. Now, whatever the history, the fact of the matter is that either Kashmir is a dispute, as Pakistan says, in which case both the Pakistani controlled parts of Kashmir and the Indian controlled parts of Kashmir are disputed, or it is no longer a dispute and both countries should work out an arrangement whereby the line of control should be redefined so that it can be in a position in which the two sides can live with the status quo. 69 years of conflict have not changed the status quo in Kashmir. I predict on your show with quite great comfort that the next 69 days or the next 69 months or possibly the next 69 years will also not see a resolution through the means that have been attempted in the past. Why can't we be friends first and solve the dispute later? The more I see around the world, most countries with disputes actually manage to resolve them better by having a friendship first, resolution of conflict later. I gave you the example of the United States and Canada. I'm sure you don't know this, and most people don't. There are 9 unresolved disputes between Canada and the United States about boundaries, about territory, and very frankly, those disputes remain alive, but they are not central to the relationship. And my argument is that by putting Kashmir, making Kashmir the central point in the relationship has worked to Pakistan's disadvantage. We miss out on all the advantages that we would have of normal relations, of being a normal country. Look, for Kashmir, this whole jihad was started, and the jihad has now started biting Pakistan back. So therefore, instead of focusing on Kashmir as the only issue that needs to be resolved before anything else, we need to change the attitude.
In a way, looking at India and China's relations as a template. Where
absolutely. $72 billion in bilateral trade, despite the fact that India and China still have a dispute. China doesn't consider Arunachal Pradesh a part of India. India doesn't recognize the control of parts of Aksai Chin by China as legitimate. But China and India managed to have normal relations.
It seemed at various points over the last decade and a half that elements of the establishment in Pakistan have begun to embrace some of the ideas that you mentioned here, that maybe insisting on the centrality of Jammu and Kashmir is not very helpful for Pakistan, and that it's time to explore neighborly relations, trade and other things, as well as more imaginative solutions to the J&K dispute insofar as you still want to consider it central. But there's been a lot of waxing and waning. The Pakistani position hasn't been consistent. We've seen times when some leaders have said UN resolutions must be applied. Others have indicated that UN resolutions aren't important. Once again, we today seem to be in a situation where Pakistan is reverting to the earlier rhetoric in the context of the disturbances in the valley, the observance of a Black Day. I fully expect in the coming General Assembly Pakistan to raise Jammu Kashmir in the way that it's done in the last couple of years. What explains this flip-flop on the Pakistani side?
So if you read my book, you will find that as early as 1959, which was only 2 years after the last UN resolution about Kashmir was passed, Pakistan's President General Ayub Khan, who was not Field Marshal at that time, he became Field Marshal later, he had actually acknowledged to the American president, President Eisenhower, in 1959, that plebiscite was not Pakistan's central demand anymore. So this process of one step forward, 1.5 steps backward, 2 steps forward, half step backward has been going on ever since. The reason for that is very simple. I think that the Kashmir issue is no longer an international dispute that needs to be solved from the point of view of Pakistan's elite. It's more about an issue that helps drive the anti-Indianism within Pakistan, which has become an integral part of Pakistani nationalism. Look, our Prime Minister can raise the issue of Kashmir in the General Assembly. He did it last year too, but he was the only one who did. Compare that with 1957, when a majority of the United Nations supported the stance that there should be a plebiscite. The fact is that Pakistan has lost international standing. So on the one hand, we want Kashmir more and more sometimes, but the more we want it, the tactics and methods we use make us lose support internationally. The explanation for why this waxing and waning takes place is because Pakistan's political leaders and Pakistan's military leaders try to use anti-Indianism as a means of strengthening Pakistani national identity and consolidating political support. I don't blame the army alone. People sometimes think that I critique the Pakistan army, but I do not blame them alone. I think many forces in Pakistan have built this anti-Indian nationalism, and I am somebody who was born a Pakistani. I say I don't need an ideology to tell me why I am a Pakistani. Pakistan needs to go beyond that. We are not at that point yet. Don't be optimistic, but that is the road we have to take.
Explain the contradiction to me in the fact that in election after election, Pakistani political parties often campaign on the slogan of improving relations with India. So it's clear that in terms of electoral politics, no party thinks it can win public support with any kind of strident anti-India campaign. How do we reconcile that reality of Pakistani electoral politics with this desire of the Pakistani military, or now, for example, Nawaz Sharif, trying to use the Kashmir issue or anti-Indianism once again in domestic politics?
I think
where does Pakistani public opinion really lie?
I think Pakistani public opinion also waxes and wanes, but I think that people do want good relations, but at the same time, what are the terms of those good relations is not something people know much about, partly because of the way national discourse is set up. It's easier for me to talk to you on Rajya Sabha TV here than it is for me to talk on Pakistani television. There's a kind of a parameter within which Pakistani discourse takes place, and that parameter is very limited. And so Pakistani public does not get to know as much about the facts of the matter. For example, there are many facts in my book. This book, my previous 2 books, people that totally get shocked. For example, when I tell people that the Afghanistan jihad was not something Pakistan did at America's behest, but it was something America did at Pakistan's behest, people get shocked, because the documents all show that Pakistan went to the Americans to say, why don't you come and set up jihad, it will tie down the Soviet Union, and the Americans said, wow, what a good idea. But it was Ziaul Haq's idea, not the Americans' idea, and Pakistanis always say, we did so much for the Americans, whereas the Americans can turn around and say, no, it was your idea, we did it, we paid for it, and now you're stuck with it, that's your problem, you did it, the decision was yours. So in Pakistan, the national narrative is maintained a certain way. And unfortunately, it's that national narrative that is sustained by periodic jingoism. And then when they see that there too much international pressure is building up against their jingoism, then they back off. My suggestion to my countrymen is, get out of this business of jingoism. Focus on substantive realities. 1/3 of Pakistani school-going age children don't go to school. Pakistan's human development indicators are poorer than any other South Asian country except perhaps Nepal. 30 years ago, Pakistan's per capita income was much higher than India's. Today, it is much less than India's. So, if we are to think about what we are and who we are, then maybe the way forward is to calm down on jingoism and build a nationalism that is positive, that cares for our own people.
One thing that many Pakistanis seem to agree on is that their country is a victim of terrorism, because perhaps the largest number of incidents anywhere in the world happen in Pakistan, claiming huge number of lives. And yet when it comes to seeing the link between groups like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan that are targeting the Pakistani army or Pakistani civilians inside Pakistan, and groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed, whose activities are against India, there's an unwillingness to recognize that you can't differentiate, you cannot have a sort of dual strategy where you go after one group and not the other. Do you think this idea, this understanding is changing in Pakistan, and that increasingly people are going to demand that action be taken not just against the TTP but also against anti-India groups, or is there still a Chinese wall separating them as far as public opinion is concerned?
I think there's some recognition but not enough, and I'll tell you why. When you frame your nationalism as the victim instead of as somebody who has contributed to one's own victimhood, then it's very difficult to see things clearly. I think that Pakistan needs far greater clarity in understanding that terrorism as a tool of statecraft is a bad tool. It always hurts the perpetrator as much as it hurts those who are targeted. Now, yes, it is true that more Pakistanis have died as a result of terrorism, but it is equally true that young terrorists keep getting trained and armed in Pakistan. The reason why I point that out is that whenever a Pakistani makes the argument that, well, we have become stuck and mired in terrorism because we fought alongside the Americans in Afghanistan, my argument is that that war ended in 1989. That's a long time ago. But the fighters that are coming and fighting in Kashmir now, and the young Taliban, because fighters have to be younger. 45-year-olds and 50-year-olds don't jump on hills and mountains. So anybody who has been born after 1989, if he is a terrorist now, he has obviously been trained well after the war in Afghanistan. Why is that training still continuing? And it is perfectly possible that a young man can get trained with Lashkar-e-Taiba and end up joining with Taliban, and there are many instances of that. There are people who have trained with Jaish-e-Mohammed and then they have ended up in Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. There are people who have trained with Harkatul Mujahideen and have ended up with Sipah-e-Sahaba, which attacks Pakistani Shias. So therefore, making this distinction is dangerous. But unfortunately, as you know very well, seeing what is happening in India in terms of the political and ideological trajectories here, you will understand that sometimes people unleash forces that they are unable to control, but then they still don't see the merit of not unleashing those forces entirely.
Right. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Lahore for the wedding of the granddaughter of Nawaz Sharif and his birthday in December 2015 was lauded by people generally on both sides as a positive step forward, showing willingness to take relations ahead. And then you had the Pathankot attack, which was a setback. Since then, the two sides have made a show of at least having some kind of joint investigative effort, but matters still seem stuck. India is not satisfied with the pace of these investigations that the Pakistanis have done. And the Pakistanis, we've heard statements, they're saying, well, if this means dialogue gets delayed, so be it. We're not dying for dialogue to start. Do you think there's any likelihood of forward movement on the Pathankot probe if it means that Pakistan will have to act against some elements within the Jaish-e-Mohammed?
This is that basically, let me just say that when you define the issue a certain way, then the consequences can't be very different from what they have been in the past. If their attitude is that we should deny anybody who engages in terrorism on the Indian side, we should refuse to accept any evidence that is collected by Indian intelligence services because they are predisposed to be anti-Pakistan. India is the enemy, so why should we listen to them? Then you will have situations like Ajmal Kasab being disowned, even though we all know that he was from Pakistan. Similarly, we'll have similar denial in the future. If an Indian spy gets arrested in Pakistan and he makes a televised confession, that is okay. But if a Pakistani terrorist gets arrested in India and he makes a televised confession, then that is fraudulent. This basically reflects a mindset. In the absence of a change in that mindset, I think we will continue to have the same process. Every Indian leader thinking, I will take a big step forward. Some Pakistani leaders thinking, yes, it is important to do that, but the circumstances and environment just not being conducive to a serious movement forward. Will there be steps? Absolutely. Prime Minister Modi might go to Pakistan again for the SAARC conference. We'll see a lot
Almost
of...
certainly he will, yeah,
And my suggestion is that we need to stop painting every interaction as a breakthrough. Because when you call it a breakthrough, then we complain about a breakdown. No breakthroughs, no breakdowns, just a kind of a low expectation engagement.
Right.
Let me say that in my book I have actually listed that there have been 55 summit level meetings between Indian and Pakistani leaders. So India of course has always had a Prime Minister. Sometimes we have had the President as the Chief Executive, sometimes Prime Minister, but 55 meetings have taken place. If 55 meetings have not broken the logjam, stop expecting that the 56th meeting will do it. Those are symbolic things. Let's not focus on the symbolism. Let's attend to the more substantive thing. Will young Pakistanis always be brought up to think of India as the eternal enemy? Will some Indians always think that Pakistan needs to be just done away with? Or will we move forward and understand we are both nuclear weapons powers, neither one can eliminate each other, we need to learn to live with one another and figure out what our commonalities are. We have 5,000 years of shared history, 69 years of partition. Which one should prevail in our interaction with one another?
Would there be any appetite on the Pakistani side? The Prime Minister will be going in November for the SAARC summit. Rajnath Singh, the Home Minister, will be there earlier. Of course, SAARC level issues will be discussed there. But would there be any appetite in Islamabad to allow some incremental progress on issues like trade, or are we going to remain hostage to Pakistan's perception of what's happening in Kashmir and their understanding that the situation there favors Pakistan's point of view right now?
Well, India unilaterally extended most favored nation status to Pakistan many years ago. Pakistan's cabinet under President Zardari and Prime Minister Gilani approved the most favored nation status for India a few years ago. It has just not been implemented. What does that tell you? Very frankly, in my experience, when somebody is engaged in a relationship and just keeps putting off the marriage, there is something wrong with the relationship, and that not being able to fix the date of the marriage is not the problem, the relationship is the problem. The same applies here. I think that somebody somewhere does not want, and that somebody somewhere can be identified on both sides. We all know that in Pakistan, every time there is forward movement on other subjects, somebody decides that no, we can't move forward without talking about Kashmir. And ironically, my book will prove to you India versus Pakistan, why can't we just be friends? It will prove to you that this has gone on since at least 1959, when the military had first taken over and General Ayub Khan had become the martial law administrator, chief martial law administrator and president. He actually was the one who started saying there can be no normalization without resolving the Kashmir dispute. The Kashmir dispute has become less and less important internationally. It has less and less support. The poor Kashmiris continue to suffer. Now, unfortunately, there's denial on the Indian side also. You have alienation in Kashmir. You have a very peculiar situation in which the political party that represents Jammu is not the political party that has the support of the people in the valley of Kashmir. That creates functional problems. There are debates over whether the IIT will be located in the valley or whether it will be located in Jammu. It basically creates a sense of deprivation among the Kashmiri Muslim youth. That said, the fact is that similar issues also happen on the Pakistani side of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. So either we remain stuck in 1948 or we move to 2016 and start moving forward. I don't think it is about to happen, Siddharth.
Right. On that note, we will have to end it there, Ambassador Hussain Haqqani. Thank you very much for joining us. Your sentiment, why can't we just be friends, is something that would be very widely shared, I dare say, by ordinary people in Pakistan and India. Let's hope your book is something which shows a way for politicians, leaders, thought leaders in both countries to proceed. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
This wraps up our episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.